we have these little pumps in our body that help to deliver certain compounds throughout the cells. Tune in to a cleaner future with Pollution Evolution.
We are your hosts,
Faith Harrison
and Kimberly Salcedo Nufane.
Welcome to episode 3, everybody. Today, we're going to find out what the Bromium is happening with Chromium. If you want to follow us along on this journey, you can find our podcast at Saturdays at 4 p.m. on YouTube, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcast. And if you would like to follow our Instagram page, it is Pollution Evolution Podcast. You can also find us on Linktree at Pollution Evolution.
Today's episode is going to focus on Chromium 6. To give our listeners context as to why we're talking about Chromium 6, Faith and I watched this movie called Erin Brokovich, and we gave a little spoiler for you guys to watch it. So whenever we watched this movie, we decided to do a deep dive into some research, and we wanted to share what we found. But first, before we get into that, we want to talk about exactly what happened in Erin Brokovich, so you guys have a better idea of what we're talking about. So Faith, would you like to get started?
Yeah, so just a really short summary. Erin Brokovich is a woman that is kind of in like a tight spot to begin with at the beginning of the movie. And she winds up stumbling upon some medical records, and she kind of convinces her lawyer to follow up on them. And she basically discovers an entire cover-up involving contaminated water in a local community, and it's basically devastated them because of the sickness. And she wounds up, with the help of her law firm, taking this company that's causing this pollution to court and winning a huge settlement. And today we're going to actually talk about the chemical and the pollutant that was involved in this settlement. This is a true story. Erin Brokovich did happen in California, and that chemical that we wanted to talk about today is real, and it's affecting many Americans. And that chemical is called hexavalent chromium.
And before we get started, I want to say that we will be discussing this chemical as hexavalent chromium and chromium 6 in this episode. So please don't get confused whenever we interchange the two. So I wanted to introduce exactly what we're going to be going over today. First, we're going to tell you what exactly chromium 6 is, because it's very important for you to understand what it is before we get into anything else. Secondly, we want to look at what the health effects are of chromium 6. And then we're going to look at who is impacted by it. And lastly, we're going to talk about what can we as a community and as a people do to combat chromium 6 exposure.
Yeah, so let's dive right into this today. I want to just start by talking about like exactly what chromium 6 is, because a lot of times we hear the name of these chemicals, but we don't actually have a face to the name. So chromium 6 is a type of chromium containing substance. And when we say 6, that means that there are 6 electrons on its outer electron shell. And we call those electrons valence electrons. That is why the name hexavalent chromium is used. So there are other forms of chromium, such as trivalent chromium and dichromate, and just other various forms of chromate containing compounds that exist. But the issue here is because of those 6 valence electrons, it makes chromium 6 very, very hazardous and toxic to not only humans, but to the overall environment and everything within those environments. And that's why we felt that it was so important to discuss this compound today, because everybody is regularly interacting with it in some capacity, and we have no idea that it could potentially be giving us cancer.
To give everybody some context, this chemical is specifically found in welding industries or hot work, quote unquote, on stainless steel and other metals containing chromium, engines that may use chromium to cool their systems, the use of pigments, spray paints, coatings, pigments being the powders that you put into paints, and then also operating chrome plating baths. So these are just some of the industrial processes that use this chemical, but there are many other sources of this chemical, and you're probably around you.
Just to note, there are also natural forms of chromium 6 that can be found in soil and through volcanic activity. So it's not only in like industry that can potentially expose you. The only difference is typically it is found at much lower concentrations in nature than it typically is found in these industrial uses.
A part per billion, to give some context, is a drop of water in a pool of water, an Olympic-sized pool of water. So that gives some context. We're going to be talking about some levels here in a moment.
Okay, and now while we're talking about these limits, let's actually discuss a little bit on the background of how the EPA wound up establishing the limit that we currently have. So, as we mentioned previously, Erin Brokovich was one of the first case to kind of bring highlight to chromium 6, and this happened in California. And California prompted the National Toxicology Program to conduct a study to see chromium hexavalent toxicity within mice. And they wound up actually finding through this study that the mice were more susceptible to cancers in their oral cavity when they had not previously been susceptible to this. And after this, there was other studies done. Well, there was one done in Texas by the TCEQ in 2014 that was ultimately discontinued, and other various research projects done throughout the US that ultimately led to the EPA establishing a standard. And that standard is 100 parts per billion. And keep in mind what Kimberly said, a part per billion is one drop of water in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And so this limit is 100 parts per billion, or zero point zero 0.01 micrograms per liter. There are many different types of chromium that are accounted for within this EPA standard of 100 parts per billion, and it is not only accounting for hexavalent chromium. And because the precursor to this MCL, or this maximum contaminant limit set by the EPA, was the lawsuit in California and the subsequent studies done, there is a specific need to introduce a higher standard for chromium 6 that is separate from total chromium, because not all of the chromium is harmful to the human body and human health. And I believe that there needs to be a distinction between those two, thinking that, oh, I'm having like chromium picolinate, which is a safe form for humans to consume. And they're like, okay, then I do not need to take as much of that. Or if they're exposed to hexavalent chromium, they might not have any idea that it's harmful because of the other forms of chromium.
I want to bring up, because you are bringing up the different forms of chromium, exactly how our bodies break down this chromium 6. Because the first step of chromium 6 entering our body, after it goes into our red blood cells, actually, it turns into chromium 3, so it's broken down. That is the healthy part of the chromium that, it helps our body function, as Faye said. But the chromium 6 that is not reduced or not destroyed and turned into chromium 3, specifically in our lungs, because our lungs have a hard time removing that, because they don't specifically have the capabilities to remove contaminants as heavily as other parts of our body. And any retained chromium 6 that is in your red blood cells can damage your DNA. Whenever I say damage your DNA, it can damage your gene expression. So for those of you who remember in science class when we talked about genes, they are formed by the TAGC components, and genes such as TP53. This is an example because it relates to chromium 6. So TP53 is essentially produces signals to tell your body when it needs to kill cells. It helps protect your body by killing off really dangerous cells that are damaging your body. But whenever you have chromium 6 in your body that's being retained, whenever it causes DNA damage, it can actually damage that TP53 producing the signal, so it can cause an increase of the protein that produces. And increases in that protein can cause further cell death, which can have effects on your brain. It can give you Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, autism. It can give you various forms of cancer, because the first step of lung cancer is actually something called bronchoalveolar hyperplasia. And so, to break that super convoluted word down, this essentially means that you get growths in your lungs. And those growths are the first part of lung cancer. So, you may not think about what happens to you after you've been exposed, but it's going into your body. It's doing these things like these are research studied pathways. All of the stuff I'm reporting are from an EPA report that we will be linking with this podcast. It's about 500 so pages. That's why I wanted to give a brief overview of that. There are a multitude of resources in there for those of you who want to look into this further.
And since Kimberly is talking about the destruction to the DNA, if you guys remember oil rig from chemistry, where we talked about oxidation is losing and reduction is gaining, when you're drinking the contaminated water that has the chromium 6 in it, as Kim mentioned, not only is it scrambling your DNA, but it's also creating free radicals in your body because that chromium is being oxidized into different forms. So chromium 6 is highly reactive as it passes through your cellular membranes. And because of that, it can pass through them using these things called sulfate transporters, essentially. And I love chemistry, so I'm excited to talk about this. So essentially, we have these little pumps in our body that help to deliver certain compounds throughout the cells. There's various process for this in microbiology, but I'm not going to bore you with that. But essentially, they can only move one type of compound in theory, and we can think of these things as kind of like trains. But sometimes, if something is just similar enough, it can also be transported in that train car. And chromium just happens to be similar enough to sulfate and phosphate. So as it starts to travel on these sulfate transporters, it creates these things called free radicals because of the oxidation and reduction process. And that is also causing damage to the DNA in addition to everything else. So you're kind of getting hit like twofold. And one of the best ways and things that I can recommend for free radical formation is eating antioxidants, and specifically eating antioxidants in water and soil that are not contaminated by chromium 6. Because antioxidants actually help to stop free radical formation, and free radicals are also another precursor to cancer. And they essentially put your body under so much stress that the more antioxidants we eat, they're kind of like little soldiers taking out each of those free radicals and making your body stronger and more resilient to stress. So all that to say is chromium hexavalent, it attacks many, many parts of the body. It's not just our digestive tract, it's not just our lungs, it's not just our brain, it's many parts of the body, and it is all working to weaken our overall system and to make us more susceptible to illnesses. And I think it makes it worse because 74 million Americans have been exposed to this chemical.
I actually want to touch on something else that, in my deep dive, something I found is, it fragments the DNA, obviously, it damages the
Mhm.
DNA,
Mhm.
and it can kill your cells. That's why whenever Faith is talking about it's not just going to be in one specific place, it's very important to consider the fact that if this is entering and going to your red blood cells, your blood is made up of red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and plasma. So the red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets are all in your plasma. Think about the fact that if your red blood cells are dying, 1 out of 4 of those systems is dying. How do you think that's going to affect your body? I mean, realistically.
It's a ripple effect. It's literally like throwing a rock into a river, but that rock is a giant chromium 6 rock.
Yeah,
And then
because
all
sorry, I wanted to add that it actually affects your ROS. So ROS, a reactive oxygen species, very important part of your body, part of what Faith was talking about as well. These help regulate so many things in your body, and they're affected by chromium 6. Your function for your reactive oxidation species in your body is affected by your exposure. So things that can be affected, for example, your cell metabolism, antioxidant defense. So when Faith is talking about eating antioxidants or taking an antioxidant, like just doing anything for antioxidants, that's super important because once your body gets compromised with chromium 6, messes with how your antioxidant defense is regulated.
Yeah. So eat
Um,
your berries and your peppers and your chilies.
yeah,
That's how that they have a ton.
yeah, because it also affects your immune function. You guys, it affects your stem cell renewal process. You know how important stem cells are?
Yeah, seriously. Like these every part of your body is being affected, and like your immunity, like how you fight disease. It's just not something to be taken lightly. And the fact that it's not actually properly regulated, knowing all of this background is why me and Kim do these episodes and why we started the Pollution Evolution podcast, because quite frankly it's absolutely bonkers that people are just continually exposed to these things, even not from industry, but like knowing that you can be exposed simply because a volcano erupted or soil eroded, and you basically have no defense if you have no idea you even need to defend yourselves. And learning about pollution and evolving your mind and your thought is so important to be able to go forward in the future and have a good quality of life, because we're coming on a point where like pollution is in every environment that we go to. It's everywhere, as we touched on last week. And so now we really have to get into the mood, and not even the mood, but the mindset of living in an environment that is filled with pollution. And how can we protect ourselves? And how can we even remove these things? And now let's kind of get into that, because again, we don't just want to scare you guys. We want to also offer some sound advice and give you some hope for the future, because there is research that's emerging that is showing potential methods for removal. And I'm just going to go into like a little bit of those. So one of the very first methods that's actually being looked at right now is membrane separation, ion exchange, reverse osmosis, and precipitation. And precipitation is actually one of the most useful methods for getting rid of chromium 6 within the water, because as Kim mentioned previously, you're typically being exposed through drinking water and through airborne pollutants. But an also lesser known way that you can be exposed to chromium 6 is through the water. So we used to live in the Panhandle, and in the Panhandle, groundwater typically is, would you say, Kim, like the thing that we use the most to grow our food and our crops?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so groundwater is applied to all of the wheat, the corn, the cotton, not the cattle. The cattle drink it. They don't just get sprayed down. That's a horrible image to put out there. They have little troughs. I promise they're not just spraying the cows. But that's going into the soil, into the food that we're eating. So you're not only getting it through drinking water, but you're getting it through your vegetables, through your meat. And in order to remediate things from the soil, the groundwater, the surface water, the air, those are some of the methods that people can employ. But obviously, those are going to be done by scientists in a controlled setting, people with experience. Now that we've touched on some of the ways that scientists are currently helping to remove chromium 6, why don't we talk about some less expensive ones? Because if anybody knows anything about membrane processes, they are notoriously expensive, like some of them in the tens of millions of dollars. So obviously, this is not feasible for the 74 million Americans that have been exposed to chromium hexavalent. So, Kim, what are some things that our listeners could actually do to help, one, combat this pollution and join the fight against chromium hexavalent contamination?
So, the first things first, in order for our listeners to determine if there is a concern in their area, you want to test your water. So, in order to test your water, first, you can do free testing. Typically, it's free. You want to check with your local water utility to make sure that it is free. But typically, whenever it is free, what they will do is they will go out, test typically your drinking water. So your drinking water will be tested, and once your drinking water is tested, they can give you a full list of contaminants. They are not typically going to test for chromium 6. So if you want chromium 6 specifically tested in your water, please let them know. If they say that they cannot do it, ask them who possibly could. It is a very, very important contaminant to know if it is in your water. So say that you have figured out what is in your water. These are some common things that you can do for water filtering in general, just so you get an idea of what is out there. So the first thing, everybody probably knows what a boil notice is. Whenever you are told that your water is unsanitary, unsafe for drinking, so you need to boil it for at least a minute. If you're at higher elevations above 6,500 feet, you're going to want to boil it for around 3 minutes. The second thing you can do is get tablets or drops. So they have different forms of tablets and drops. They have iodine, they have chlorine dioxide, tetraglycine, sodium. Each of these is fit for a specific use and specific contaminant. So first, like I said, you want to know what is in your water. The third thing that you can do is use activated charcoal filters. So for those of you who probably have used a Brita before, Pure, or any of those water filters, they have used activated charcoal before in these filtering systems. So activated charcoal is really, really good at taking up and storing toxic compounds, even smells and germs. It reduces fluoride and heavy metals. So fluoride is one we will probably talk in one of our later episodes about, but it's also a very important chemical. You don't want to be ingesting too much of it. Okay? Another thing you can do is buy a travel-sized sediment filter. These are store-bought filters and designed to remove germs, bacteria from natural water. So they have pumping ones, they have straws and water bottles that filter for you, squeezable pouch filters, and a water pitcher, as I mentioned previously. You can also make a DIY portable sediment filter. So these you could actually make in a water bottle depending on what your necessity is for water. Let me walk you through this actually. You can create your own water filter to remove smell and debris, so anything that's any particulates or anything that may be floating around in your water. So you're going to want to layer gravel, sand, and activated carbon into whatever you're using. So either a water bottle or a big bucket. You're going to want to drill a hole in the bottom, make sure you have a hole in the top so that the water can enter and exit once it has been filtered. Those are the filtering methods that I recommend. Obviously, not all of these are going to be beneficial. Actually, most of these aren't going to take out chromium 6, which is why the next step, if you cannot filter your water safely, I highly recommend getting it tested by an outside lab and trying to collect data between you, your neighbors, or even getting the free testing. Building a data set with the people that you know have been affected. Get, if you can, medical records to try to determine if there are possible links between this pollution and your health. Obviously, don't be making unsubstantiated claims. Don't go around saying something that is not true. Please go through the resources that we have. Obviously, just because you have been exposed to chromium 6 does not mean you will develop these symptoms or these diseases. It is just a possibility. So that's why we wanted to inform everybody about this. Please try to preserve our environment I want trying to introduce at this time a drinking water campaign specifically for hexavalent chromium that Faith and I are putting together that we have been working on actually. We are trying to raise funds to be able to purchase some of these chromium 6 sampling kits. We are not in a financial position to purchase enough to be able to sample a big enough sample size to get somebody to respond. So that brings up a very good point that I think we forgot to mention is in order to have action, in order to make change, you need to have a significant amount of data or complaints or people coming forward. And that's why we always say community is so important.
Yeah, if you and multiple of your members are experiencing the same thing, but nobody's talking to each other, nobody's saying like, hey, I've noticed that like we have this metallic taste in our water, or or in some cases I've noticed that like I've been having some respiratory issues, I've been getting some formations on my throat since I moved here, and other people aren't discussing that, then how will others in your community know that they're also other people suffering the same things as them. And I feel like the power of community is how we get change to happen, because if multiple people complain or multiple people get testing or request testing to be done, because sometimes in certain cases you can actually request for a monitoring campaign to be implemented in your location if you get enough complaints or response. Specifically, we live in Texas, so the TCEQ would come out if they have received a certain amount of complaints or notices about things that allude to some sort of pollutions, either smell or odor, noises, appearance. It could I'm speaking very generally because this applies to a lot of different pollutants, so I can't give like specific examples for each of them. And they can actually come out and like start a monitoring campaign, and that actually is one of the first steps to getting legislation changed and to making things become regulated, because you can't just say, okay, this is bad, let's change the regulations. Like, there is bureaucracy, there is process, there are laws, and we have to follow them and make sure that we're doing the due diligence to truly get change to happen.
Yeah, and so I think that with all of that, is there anything else you'd like to add before we conclude our episode, Faith?
Yeah, again, if you guys would like to donate to our research fund, we have our GoFundMe linked in the bio and also on our link tree. Obviously, if you are in no position to donate, we completely understand. Financially, things are looking grim outside. But if you're interested in helping us collect more testing kits and getting a broader understanding of chromium hexavalent, we would really appreciate all of your support. We thank you so much for listening today, and we hope that you learned something new about chromium 6.
Thanks for joining us to learn what the bromium is happening with chromium.
See you next week, where we dive into our favorite topic ever, carbon black.
For those of you who don't know what that is, please look it up before next episode. You will be shocked.
Yeah, alrighty. Bye.
Bye.
I'm so sorry, Kim.
Sorry.